When Paul reaches the front, those ideals disappear remarkably quickly. And instead of glory, we're given hunger and exhaustion, mud and lice and shellfire and hospitals and waiting around, and this constant awareness that death can arrive completely without warning.
Hi Ian, thank you for joining me today for our podcast on our set text of this year, Im Westen nichts Neues, or All Quiet on the Western Front. Before we dive into the novel and learn a bit more about the author and the structure of the text, could you tell us a bit about yourself, please?
Yeah, of course. I'm Ian Ellison. I was born in Liverpool, and before I came to Oxford, I spent almost 8 years living and working in Germany, mainly in Frankfurt and at the German Literature Archive in Marbach. I came to Oxford in January 2024 as the postdoctoral researcher on the AHRC-funded Kafka's Transformative Communities project. And from September, I'll be departmental lecturer in German here at Jesus College, where I'll be teaching modern German literature from the mid-1700s to the present day and translation. And my research covers quite a wide range of German and European literature from the 18th century right through to today. I'm particularly interested in how texts survive across time, how later generations keep reading and translating and adapting and remembering them. So I'm quite fascinated by not just how literary works are written, but by what happens to them afterwards, how they become classics. I suppose that's one reason, actually, that I enjoy teaching German literature and writing about it. It isn't just about Germany. German literature sits at the heart of so many European conversations about history and politics and philosophy and culture. So reading German literature helps us understand not just one country, but the modern world, I think, more generally. And that's one of the reasons I was really pleased to be asked to talk about Im Westen nichts Neues by Erich Remarque, because it's a novel that has had such an extraordinary cultural afterlife.
Yes, absolutely. So let's get into Im Westen nichts Neues. And I would like to start with the author. Could you tell us who was Erich Remarque?
I think that's a great place to start, because in some ways the history of the novel begins with Remarque himself. He was born in 1898 in Osnabrück in northwest Germany, so he belonged to almost exactly the same generation as the novel's protagonist, Paul Bäumer. Like, Paul Remarque was still a very young man when he was called up during the First World War. He was conscripted towards the end of the conflict, sent to the Western Front and wounded in 1917 by shell fragments, and he spent the remainder of the war recovering in military hospitals. Now, it's tempting to think of Im Westen nichts Neues simply as his autobiography in a fictional form, but I think that's a bit too simplistic. Of course, his experiences matter a huge amount. They give the novel much of its authenticity, but Remarque himself tells us in the preface that this is not intended as the story of one individual. Instead, he's saying it's an attempt to speak for an entire generation, eine Generation, die vom Kriege zerstört wurde, auch wenn sie seinen Granaten entkam. A generation that's destroyed by the war, even if it escapes its shells. And I think that sentence is really key to understanding the novel. It's not simply about what happened to Remarque, it's about what happened to thousands and thousands of young men across Europe whose lives were fundamentally altered by the First World War. Paul Bäumer is an individual character with his own distinctive voice, but he also represents something larger. And I think that's why the novel actually feels so immediate today. Even readers who know very little about the First World War usually recognize something in Paul's experience. They recognize the uncertainty of youth, the importance of friendship, the struggle to hold on to a sense of humanity under difficult and impossible circumstances. And those are questions that go far beyond just the historical moment when the novel was written.
Yeah,
or when it's set.
Yeah. So now that we've mentioned the novel so much, maybe we can talk about it. We've talked about the author. Can you tell us a bit more about the novel itself?
Yes, of course. And I think one of the things to say right at the start, one of the things I admire so much about the novel is the way that it really doesn't lecture the reader. There's remarkably few political speeches for what is in many ways a very political novel. Remarque tends to let experience do the work, so rather than telling us that the war is terrible, he instead allows us to accompany Paul through hunger and exhaustion and boredom and terror and grief, and then occasional moments of happiness as well. And we gradually arrive at our own judgments through what we've witnessed. So that's why I think the first-person narration of this novel is so important. We don't observe the war from above as though we're reading a history book or something. We experience it from the ground level. We're on the ground with these characters alongside somebody who often understands no more than we do as readers. So we're not given that kind of panoramic view of battles or military strategy. Instead, the world is shrunk to the size of Paul's immediate surroundings and his comrades and his trench, his next meal or the next shell that falls. And that narrowing of perspective really reflects what life at the front was actually felt like, I think. And I think another thing that's easy to forget is that actually the novel isn't primarily interested in military history. It's interested in this generation. It's interested in people. As I mentioned, Remarque's preface says that the novel's about a generation destroyed by war, and that is a phrase that often gets quoted, but I think it's worth sitting with it for a bit and pausing over what it might mean. Not everyone in that generation died. Many of them survived, and yet Remarque is kind of suggesting that survival itself can also be a form of loss. So it's the whole generation that we're talking about here. Paul and his classmates volunteer directly from school after being encouraged by their teacher, Erich, who represents an older generation of people full of patriotic ideals. And they leave the classroom, the schoolmates leave the classroom expecting adventure and glory, and instead they encounter industrialized slaughter on a scale that they just couldn't have imagined. And by the time that they return home on leave, they no longer feel at home there, and they've become strangers both to civilian society and in some ways also to themselves. And I think one of the most striking passages in the novel comes when Paul reflects on this loss of youth. He realizes that his generation has kind of aged prematurely. They're barely 20 years old, and yet they feel as though the ordinary future that should have awaited them has somehow gone. It's disappeared. And they're no longer simply able to imagine, I don't know, careers or having a family or just living a peaceful life in the way that they could, because the war has interrupted not only their present, but actually the future as well. And I do think that's one of the reasons the novel remains so moving in many ways, because it's not just about death and conflict, even though that's important. It's about that loss of possibility. Remarque is kind of asking us to think about everything that never happens because of this war, the lives that might have been lived and the friendships that might have continued and the futures that never arrive. And I think that's why it continues to speak, this novel, to readers who know very little perhaps about the details of the First World War. Most of us, I think, in this room and watching this podcast have never experienced trench warfare, thankfully, but we can all understand that feeling that historical events can suddenly change the course of ordinary lives and possibilities are kind of snuffed out. Remarque actually takes one of the largest events in modern history here in this novel, and he continually brings it back to the scale of individual human experience. And I think that's why the novel made such an impact when it first appeared. It didn't present the war through the generals or the politicians or the national myth or like the military strategy, as I say. It's through the eyes of one ordinary young man. And in doing that, it gives readers a way of thinking about war that's very human rather than military or political.
Yeah, those are great points. And I think this is a great first overview of the novel. Can we get even deeper? Could you tell us a bit more about the plot and maybe also the structure of the novel?
Yeah, of course. I think it's worth saying from that outset as well that Westen, nichts, Neues isn't a war novel in the sense that many people might expect before they read it. So if you think of a conventional war film or an adventure story, you tend to expect a clear plot. You maybe expect a decisive battle or a heroic mission or a journey towards a victory or defeat. And Remarque's novel never really works in that way. It works quite differently. It's certainly got a beginning and an end, but much of the experience of reading it comes from not following a dramatic sequence of events like a plot, but from something we might think of more as like the shared rhythms of everyday life at the front. It's one thing after another. So the novel follows Paul Bäumer, as I mentioned, a 19-year-old German soldier, and his group of friends on the Western Front. Many of them have volunteered straight from school, as I mentioned, and I think one of the novel's ironies is the way that that older generation that has taught them at school has filled these young men with ideals that the older generation will never actually have to test out. That's the generation that's speaking most confidently about the conflict, but not the one that has to fight it. And so when Paul reaches the front, those ideals disappear remarkably quickly. And instead of glory, we're given hunger and exhaustion, mud and lice and shellfire and hospitals and waiting around, and this constant awareness that death can arrive completely without warning. But I think what makes the novel really compelling, makes the plot, insofar as there is one really compelling, is that these experiences are interspersed with moments of real ordinariness. So the soldiers are worried about their boots, or they're worried about food, or just finding somewhere dry to sleep. They also tease one another, they play cards, they tell jokes, and they celebrate small comforts when they can. And this is really one of the novel's great achievements, I think. It reminds us that soldiers remain ordinary human beings, even in conflict. We're not simply talking about heroes or victims. These are ordinary men trying to preserve something that resembles a normal life under profoundly abnormal circumstances. And so structurally, if not exactly in a plot, that's what the novel's structure is kind of reflecting, that day-to-day experience. And as I said, instead of building towards a great climax or a big battle, it unfolds as a series of episodes. So there's periods of intense bombardment, followed by stretches of relative calm. Paul also goes home on leave and he returns to the front. He spends time in hospital, undertakes different duties. He also loses friends. He forms new relationships and continues to just endure, really, the repetitive routines of trench warfare. And that episodic structure to the novel, I think, is really important because it does reflect what trench warfare would actually have felt like. Modern industrial warfare at this period was characterized not by constant movement and running around a battlefield, but this kind of grinding repetition. Soldiers are often spending weeks waiting, punctuated by sudden moments of extreme violence. And so time itself and the way it passes starts to feel quite distorted, and your life becomes a question of surviving one day to the next and then to the next. And one of the consequences of that, I think, and you get this sense reading the novel, is that there's very little sense of progress. So it's not like another term we might come across when studying German literature, not like a Bildungsroman or a kind of coming-of-age novel about somebody's development. Paul doesn't steadily develop towards maturity in the conventional sense. If anything, the opposite is happening here. The war is kind of stripping away rather than adding things. It removes illusions, it removes expectations, it removes possibilities. So Paul certainly gains experience, but it's an experience that he didn't want, he never wanted, and one that leaves him increasingly uncertain about what sort of future might even still be possible after the war. Alongside Paul himself, the novel introduces us to quite a memorable group of fellow soldiers. Perhaps the most important is Kaczynski, usually called Kat, the oldest member of the group. He is practical, resourceful, and endlessly inventive when it comes to finding food or solving problems, everyday problems. He becomes something like an older brother, maybe even a father figure for Paul, and I think their friendship is one of the real emotional cores of the novel. One of the things that Remarque shows so beautifully, I think, is that comradeship isn't presented as something abstract or like a kind of idealized form of patriotism. It's something much smaller and more immediate. The soldiers depend on each other because their survival depends on one another. They share their food, they protect each other during the bombardments, and they care for the wounded, and they develop a kind of instinctive understanding that actually often doesn't require words either. It's one of the paradoxes of the novel that war destroys almost everything, but it also creates extraordinarily intense human relationships. And the Remarque never ever suggests that this justifies the war in any way, far from it, but he does show that solidarity and kindness remain possible even under the most brutal conditions. As the novel progresses, however, those friendships become increasingly fragile because the war gradually removes them one by one. So without giving away every detail for anyone who hasn't yet read the novel, though that is a bit difficult when talking about it, many of the people that Paul comes to depend on are killed during the course of the story. And these losses accumulate almost quietly in the novel because Remarque rarely pauses for dramatic speeches or extended periods of mourning. Death is frightening because it's become so ordinary. It's another ordinary thing in this novel. One moment someone's joking with his friends, a few pages later he's gone. And I think among the most famous episodes in the novel is the scene where Paul becomes trapped in a shell crater with a French soldier whom he has mortally wounded. And I think this is almost, we could think of it as like the moral center of the novel, because until this point, the enemy's largely distant. Another army's firing shells from somewhere beyond the trenches, and suddenly Paul finds himself face to face with one dying individual. And he tries desperately to save him, to talk to him, to apologize to him, and searches through his belongings and gradually realizes that this isn't an abstract enemy, but another person, another human being with a family, with a profession, and a life that's been interrupted by exactly the same war. And I think it's an extraordinarily powerful scene because it strips away the language of national conflict. For a few hours, there's no Germans and Frenchmen. There's two people trapped together by circumstances out of their control. But I also think, having said that, Paul's experiences away from the front are also really key to this novel. So when he comes back home on leave, he discovers something unexpected. His home no longer feels like home. His family, his former teachers, his civilian acquaintances simply can't understand what life at the front has been like. So they ask him questions, they give him opinions about military strategy, and they speak quite confidently about the war. But Paul realizes that there's now a kind of unbridgeable gap, if you like, between those who have fought and those who haven't. And it's maybe one of the saddest parts of the novel because it's where he begins to understand that even if he survives physically, he may not be able to return psychologically to the life that he once imagined for himself. The ending of the novel, if we're thinking in terms of beginning to end plots, the ending of the novel is famous, and I think it's deservedly famous, and I don't think I can avoid this spoiler when talking about it. Paul dies in October 1918, only a short time before the end of the war itself. On that day, the military communique reports simply the title of the novel, Im Westen nichts Neues, nothing new on the Western Front. And it's an ending of extraordinary restraint. From the military's perspective, Paul's death is insignificant. Nothing strategically important has happened. Yet for the reader, who has spent the entire novel accompanying Paul through his fears and hopes and friendships, everything has happened. One ordinary human life has come to an end, and I think that contrast captures what the novel manages to achieve as a whole. History often records wars through battles and treaties and casualty or mortality statistics, but instead Remarque is asking us to think over the course of this novel, the course of this plot, about individual lives. And the novel is continually reminding us that every statistic All of those statistics added up consist of countless personal stories. So by focusing on one soldier and his friends, he's transforming what otherwise might be an overwhelming historical event into something immediate and intimate, and actually, I think, profoundly human.
What a brilliant overview and concise overview of
not so concise
of Im Westen nichts Neues. No, I think that was great. Thank you. If we turn to the style of the novel, I think one thing students often come across when they read up on Im Westen nichts Neues is that it belongs to Neue Sachlichkeit, or new objectivity in German. What does that actually mean, and how does Remarque fit into that?
It's a really good question, because Neue Sachlichkeit can sound like one of those intimidating literary labels, but actually the basic idea is fairly straightforward. Very broadly speaking, Neue Sachlichkeit, or new objectivity, was one of the defining literary and artistic movements of the Weimar Republic during the 1920s. And it emerged partly as a reaction against an earlier movement known as Expressionism, which had dominated so much of the previous decade. So Expressionist writers are often favouring highly emotional language, dramatic imagery, visionary or symbolic writing. And Neue Sachlichkeit, this new objectivity, it's there in the name, it's deliberately moving in a different direction. So instead of heightened emotion, it aims for clarity, and we're dispensing with grand rhetoric, instead focusing on careful, almost dispassionate observation, not entirely dispassionate, but careful observation. So instead of presenting the writer as a kind of genius, in a way, it's imagining the writer as an observer, somebody almost making a documentary, if you like, about the modern world, or a journalist or a sociologist or something, paying close attention to everyday reality. The Austrian writer Joseph Roth wrote in 1927, "Es handelt sich nicht mehr darum zu dichten, das Wichtigste ist das Beobachtete." So, in other words, what matters is no longer poetic invention or being poetic, but careful observation. That's the important thing. Around the same time, the journalist Egon Evin Kirsch famously remarked that nothing is more astonishing than simple truth, and nothing more sensational than the age in which you live. And when you read Remarque's novel, you can immediately see why critics then associate Im Westen nichts Neues with this movement of Neue Sachlichkeit. The prose, the writing in this novel is remarkably restrained. He's rarely indulging in elaborate metaphors or emotional speeches. Instead, he's building a world through these concrete details that I mentioned before: the mud, the boots, the rats, the food, the smell of the hospitals, the weight of the equipment, and just the practical problems of survival. So there's almost a documentary quality to those descriptions. One of the reasons I think the novel actually still feels so modern, perhaps even so contemporary, is that Remarque is trusting observation. Rather than telling you what the war means, he's showing us what the war looks and feels like. So we experience the daily routine, we experience the boredom and the fear and the exhaustion alongside Powell. And the emotional force of the novel comes not from exaggerated, metaphorical, literary language, but a careful accumulation of observed detail. And so actually the restraint and the pared downness of that novel is in many ways one of its greatest artistic strengths, I think. I think readers often find that some of the most shocking moments in the novel are described in this really matter-of-fact way. Remarque doesn't really linger over scenes of violence for dramatic effect. Death is frequently very sudden, it's almost casual. Somebody, as I said before, who's joking with his friends is then maybe not there on the next page or two. And in a strange way, that understatement makes the violence even more powerful, because it reflects the way that war is normalizing the abnormal. But I do think it's also worth saying that I don't think this novel is just one that can be reduced to an example of Neue Sachlichkeit. So one thing I've emphasized with students is in many contexts is that literary movements are useful as categories, but no great novel or no novel really fits neatly into any single box. So for all its documentary precision, as I've been talking about, Im Westen nichts Neues actually is also capable of quite extraordinary lyrical moments. So perhaps the best examples are Remarque's descriptions of nature. Throughout the novel, nature is appearing again and again: the trees, the birds, the butterflies, poplar, avenues, fields, the changing seasons, and even the earth itself. And those are passages in the novel that are written in a noticeably different register or different kind of style from the descriptions of trench warfare. The language slows down, it becomes quieter in some way, I think maybe more reflective. And one of the most famous examples of this perhaps comes during the bombardments, when Paul is speaking about the earth almost as if it were a living being, as if it were alive. So it's sheltering the soldiers, it's protecting them from shell fire, and it's giving them a place, it's giving them something to cling to. And for a few moments, it's almost as if it becomes maternal. So nature isn't sentimentalized, I don't think. It's still existing alongside this terrible destruction, but it offers fleeting reminders of a world that existed before the war and may perhaps exist again afterwards. So that contrast between nature and technology is there throughout the novel, I think. So yeah, on the one hand, you have the machinery of modern warfare, the artillery, the machine guns, the poison gas, the endless industrial destruction. And on the other, we have reminders of an older, quieter world that continues almost indifferently, in a way, beyond or alongside the battlefield. And I think what's interesting is that Remarque never really suggests that nature's become violent. Rather, it's human beings who have transformed the landscape into a battlefield. The natural world continues its own rhythms. If we're talking about the rhythms in the novel and the sequence in the novel, the natural world continues its own rhythms, even while people are destroying each other within it. And I do think that's another reason that the novel is so powerful. These moments of beauty never quite erase the horror of the war, but they remind both Powell and the reader of what has been lost, or what's still there or being lost, but also what is worth preserving. Maybe I think another aspect that goes slightly beyond just a more straightforward exemplification of Neue Sachlichkeit is the novel's emotional depth. So sometimes people hear the phrase new objectivity and they imagine that these are writers who want to eliminate emotion altogether. And that's not really the case. But what changes is just the way that the emotion is communicated. So instead of these dramatic outbursts that earlier works might have used, Remarque is often allowing feelings to emerge indirectly. So we come to understand Paul's emotional state not because he constantly tells us what he feels, but because we watch his reactions over time. Gradually, he becomes less capable of imagining a future. That ordinary civilian life that I mentioned is starting to feel remote. Home no longer feels like home. His generation has lost something that can't be recovered. And I think that's a recurring emotional theme of the novel, is that kind of loss of youth. As I mentioned, this is a generation that feels itself almost old before its time. They've become, as Powell says elsewhere in the novel, practical, skeptical, and emotionally hardened simply in order to survive. So in a way, the tragedy is not only that many of them die, but that the ones who survive, if they survive, feel unable to return to their lives that they once expected or had hoped to lead. And I think, that's another way of remembering that this isn't just an example of a narrow definition of Neue Sachlichkeit. I mean, even in the 1920s, critics were disagreeing about what Neue Sachlichkeit was. So some of them are admiring its commitment to observation, but others are wondering whether just describing events are enough. And I think that's a valid question. You know, can literature really criticize society if it only observes it? Or do writers need to go further and actively imagine alternatives? Those are important debates within the context of the Weimar Republic, I think, and maybe still today, aspects that we can think about when reading more contemporary literary works. So I think Remarque's novel offers an interesting answer because, as I said earlier, it rarely preaches. It really doesn't tell you what to think. Instead, it puts an enormous amount of faith in the moral force of this kind of attentive description. So observing ordinary experience with honesty and with precision is kind of inviting readers to come to their own conclusion. So in a way, it combines the clarity and precision that traditionally gets associated with Neue Sachlichkeit, but also with something a bit more timeless, perhaps, this kind of compassion for ordinary human beings. It's both documentary and it's quite deeply emotionally humane. So perhaps that's one reason among many why readers continue to respond to it almost a century. It is almost a century after it was published, and it never feels as though it's trying to persuade us. It never feels to me like a particularly old novel either, but it's still simply asking us to look carefully and suggesting that sometimes just looking carefully and paying attention is the beginning to understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. As you've said before, it doesn't feel like a 100-year-old novel. It feels quite modern.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that was a great context to, as you called it, imitating literary label and how we need to sometimes also be careful with those.
Yeah.
Before we finish, I'd like to ask about the title itself. We said Westen nichts Neues so many times now. It's probably one of the most famous titles in world literature. What do we make of this title? What do you make of this title?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think it's a title that becomes more powerful the longer you think about it. On a first reading, it seems completely unremarkable. In Westen nichts Neues, as I mentioned before, it just means nothing new in the West, or on the Western Front, I guess. It's the sort of brief military message that might appear on a report, right? As a summary that nothing strategically significant has happened. But of course, by the time we reach that final page of the novel, we realise that this apparently ordinary sentence, apparently ordinary title, carries enormous emotional weight. From the perspective of military history, as I said before, this report is totally accurate. Paul dies on a day when the army records that there's nothing new to report. There's no decisive battle, there's no breakthrough, there's no change in the course of the war, but for the reader, who's been invested in this for many pages, everything has changed. We've spent the entire novel alongside Paul. We've watched him lose friends and struggle with fear and return home on leave, confronting the death of the French soldier, and gradually losing the future that he imagined. So his death is the culmination of everything that we've experienced as readers. And this one extraordinary, ordinary and extraordinary sentence in the title is exposing this kind of gap between the two ways of recording history. And I do think that's one of the novel's great achievement, that it asks us, as I mentioned earlier, to look beyond statistics, to look beyond strategy and grand narratives of history, or abstract discussions of patriotism and nations and victories, and to remember that wars are lived in many ways with one person at a time, all alongside each other. I think it also says something about bureaucracy in a way. That through the novel, we see individual human beings constantly absorbed into much larger systems. We might think of them, the armies, the governments, military hierarchies, official reports. Paul becomes one soldier among millions. His death is administratively or bureaucratically insignificant. And by having this as its title, in a way, the novel, when you finish it, is kind of insisting that no human life is in fact insignificant. I've got two copies of the book here. There's a battered old copy of the German, but also a slightly newer copy of the English translation, which I think we'll hear more about in other episodes. I think the English title is also fascinating and worth talking about. Most English-speaking readers know the novel not as Nothing New on the Western Front or Nothing New in the West, but which would be more literal, but as all quiet on the Western Front. So it's not a literal translation, but it's become enormously famous in its own right. In fact, many English speakers probably know this title better than the German original, which is an interesting reminder that translations can often develop lives of their own. It's sometimes the case that a translated title becomes almost as culturally significant as the original. There's a famous parallel here with a French writer, Marcel Proust, who I also did some work on a while ago, and the German translations of his work. But for much of the 20th century, English readers knew his great novel, À la recherche du temps perdu, as Remembrance of Things Past, which is quite a loose translation, but actually also borrowed from a Shakespeare sonnet. So it's not a literal rendering, and actually today most editions would use a closer translation, In Search of Lost Time. But for generations of readers, Remembrance of Things Past acquired a kind of literary life of its own. And I think something similar has happened with All Quiet on the Western Front. So much so that the phrase has actually entered everyday English. People, when they use it, they occasionally use it kind of jokingly or casually to describe situations where nothing appears to be happening. You know, everything's quiet on the Western Front, nothing's happening. So in other words, it's as if the title has kind of escaped from the novel and become part of another language, not the one it was written in. And for me, as someone who's interested in literary afterlives, that kind of metaphorical way of thinking about how novels live on or other literary works live on, I find that particularly fascinating. It's an example of a work of literature shaping everyday speech long after many people might have forgotten, if they ever knew, where the phrase originally came from. In that regard, I think it's also maybe worth mentioning Edward Berger's 2022 film adaptation, which introduced this story to a new generation, or perhaps multiple generations, and certainly an international audience, and also won widespread critical acclaim. I think it's a remarkable film in many respects. Visually, it captures the physical destruction of industrial warfare very intensely. The landscapes of the mud and the shell craters and the ruined forests convey something of that terrifying scale of the conflict in a way that cinema is uniquely well equipped to do. But at the same time, I think it's important to recognize that the film and the novel are trying to achieve slightly different things. One of the biggest differences is that it actually expands that historical perspective that I was talking about right at the start. So the film does include scenes involving German generals and negotiations surrounding the armistice, and it allows viewers then to kind of move between the battlefield and the political leadership, whereas the original novel is, as we've been talking about, much more restricted. Almost everything is filtered through Powell's experience. We only know what he knows. We remain among ordinary soldiers for almost the entire narrative, and that narrower perspective is so central to the novel's power because it refuses to let us escape into the larger historical picture. We don't see it, as I said earlier, from above, but from that ground level. So as much as I admire the film, it's one reason I would always encourage people to read the novel, even if they have seen the film as well. Cinema can represent the physical spectacle of war really well, but literature allows us, and the novel in many ways is such a unique form because of this, it allows us to inhabit another person's consciousness over many pages. So we experience Powell's thoughts, his uncertainties, and his changing relationship to the world around him, which is something I think no adaptation, however successful or true, can quite reproduce in the same way, though of course they're probably complementary. But I also think actually there's perhaps that final irony of the title that tells us that there's nothing new, because as we said, it's almost a century after the novel was first published, and readers are continuing to discover it for the first time. So every new generation is bringing different questions to it, noticing different aspects of it, and finding new meanings in it. So in a way, there's always something new in Westen, nichts, Neues, despite the title.
That's a great answer. I really like that. Ian, to finish up, maybe the hardest question and the biggest question of them all, and you can give a brief answer if you want. In your opinion, what makes Westen, nichts, Neues a German classic?
That's a really good question, because I think it's one that doesn't have a single answer. It's a question that goes beyond Remarque. It goes maybe beyond the novel. One of the things that I'm interested in when I study literature is what happens to books after they're published, once they're out in the world. Why do some of them disappear almost immediately, whereas others continue to be read and translated and adapted and discussed, like this one, for centuries? What is it that turns them into a classic? I don't think a classic just means simply an old book, or even a very good one, although I think this one is a good one. Rather, it's a work that continues to reward new readers over time, because each generation finds itself asking different questions of it. And so in that sense, a classic is not a fixed thing. It acquires new meanings as history and context changes around it. So I think this novel remains accessible in a way that many other older classics perhaps might not be. Students approaching it sometimes experience a slight disorientation because they're expecting something distant or more intimidating. Because, as we said, it's nearly a century old and it deals with a big historical subject. But once you start reading, I think it's often surprising how immediate it feels. The prose is really clear, the characters are very vividly portrayed, and many of the questions the novel raises about belonging and about growing up and about the relationship between generations and that search for meaning during and after catastrophic events, that still feels recognizable today. So if we're thinking why Im Westen nichts Neues deserves to be called a German classic, which I think it does, I actually don't think I would say that, look at the fact that it's on school syllabuses, or even to the millions of copies sold, or even to the film adaptations, multiple film adaptations, even though they're all impressive. I think I would instead say this continuing ability to create thoughtful readers and their responses to it. So nearly a century after it first appeared, it's still being read and discussed and adapted, and we're discovering new aspects to it that others might have overlooked or not explored before. So it's a sign not only that the novel has survived, but that it remains alive in some way. And I think that's the best definition of a classic that I can think of anyway, that a book that does belong to the past, but it doesn't only belong to the past. It continues to create new conversations today.
I'm sold on that definition. I think that's a great definition. Thank you so much, Ian. That was a brilliant introduction to Remarque's Im Westen nichts Neues.